All right, we left off with talking about the ovarian cycle and ovulation. So we discussed the oocyte, which is developing inside the ovary, inside the follicle. And remember, ovulation occurs when this oocyte is released from both the follicle and ovary, which is what this picture over here is showing with the little white cotton ball. So now we're going to discuss at what point does this ovulation occur during the female cycle. All right. So here we have the ovarian cycle and ovulation. So think about how long a female cycle is. Generally speaking, classic textbook is about 28 days. Of course, that's going to vary from female to female, but let's just take, for example, a standard 28 days. So where ovulation occurs during that 28 days is right in the middle. So just for frame of reference, out of 28 days, day 1 of the cycle is when the female starts menstruating. So that's when she gets her period. And so if it's a 28-day cycle and day 1 is the first day of menstruation, ovulation again occurs right in the middle, which is at day 14. So this right here at day 14 would be ovulation. And then in the beginning, this would be day 1, the menstruation. And then all the way over here would be day 28. So very important, you know that hormones are involved in a female's monthly cycle. There's 2 hormones involved here called FSH and LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So based on its name, what do you think it does? It's obviously going to stimulate the follicle. So remember, the follicle was that protective, nourishing cover for the growing oocyte. So here's the oocyte, and then you can see the follicle developing around it. And that's occurring within the first 14 days or the first half of the woman's ovarian cycle. And then remember, at day 14, ovulation occurs, the oocyte is released, and so here's the follicle. So notice FSH is pretty high in the beginning, and then it takes a drop a little bit. But during the first half of the cycle is when we have the majority of our FSH. LH, on the other hand, is luteinizing hormone. And you can see LH here in the purple line. So take a look at this graph, and you can tell that the first half we're going to call the follicular phase, because this is when the follicle is growing and maturing. After the egg is ovulated, you don't need the follicle anymore. So the second half is called the luteal phase, and I'll let you know what that means later. So take a look and see which hormone surges right before ovulation. So again, this is ovulation right here. And which hormone is surging right before? You'll notice it's this hormone in purple, which is the luteinizing hormone. So right before ovulation, luteinizing hormone surges or peaks, and that's actually what triggers the ovulation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to link the ovulation cycle with the menstrual cycle, which is what you more commonly probably think of and have familiarity with. So in this diagram, the first part is what we just saw, the ovulation cycle. And then down here on the second part is the menstrual cycle. So what you're seeing here on the bottom is the menstruation process, and then hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So let's go through this. All right, so remember, the first half of the cycle, days 1 through 14, the oocyte is maturing in the follicle. This is the follicular phase. One thing to add to the follicle is not only does it protect and nourish the oocyte, it's actually releasing estrogen. So the female hormone estrogen is released from these follicles. So what estrogen does is it helps build up the endometrium. So let's talk about what the endometrium is. So the woman's uterus is where a baby will develop, if there is one, and the endometrium is the lining of the uterus. And we know endo means inside, so it's the inner lining of the uterus. So the endometrium is actually mostly just a layer of blood. Now think about it. Why would you want the uterus lined with blood? It's because, of course, we know blood is nourishing. So if you're going to have a growing baby in the uterus, you want a lot of blood to help nourish that baby. So in the beginning of the female cycle, when there's a lot of estrogen around, the estrogen helps build up the endometrium, which is the blood lining. And it turns out that this estrogen causes the LH surge. So if you look here, you can see estrogen in yellow, and it starts building up in the follicular phase from day 1 to 14. Down here, you see the endometrium, which is blood, also building up because the estrogen causes the endometrium to build up. And at the same time, the estrogen causes this LH surge right here, which we know causes ovulation at day 14. So again, all of this is happening in the first 14 days or the first half of the female cycle. Next, after ovulation, remember we do not need the follicle anymore because the egg is gone. Instead, the follicle turns into the structure called the corpus luteum. So that's where we get the luteal phase. The corpus luteum now releases the second common female hormone, which is progesterone. So progesterone in this graph is shown in green. And so you notice when the corpus luteum is around for days 14 to 28, the progesterone levels go really high. Now, the important thing about progesterone is that it helps maintain the endometrium. So notice days 14 to 28, you see the endometrium, the blood lining, being really high. And that's because if the oocyte is ovulated on day 14 and it happens to be fertilized by the sperm, this is when we're going to need a lot of blood to help nourish that growing, originally zygote into the embryo, which is going to be the growing baby. All right. So then what happens afterwards is, let's say there's actually no pregnancy. Do you still need this thick endometrium or blood lining of the uterus if there's no pregnancy or no baby to nourish? No, you don't need it. So that actually brings us to the end of the woman's cycle. Here's day 28, and you can see what happens is that the levels of estrogen and progesterone drop off. So you have low levels of estrogen and progesterone, and therefore you can't build up or maintain an endometrium. So you'll notice what happens is you start to shed the endometrium. And again, that's just the blood lining. So that leads to the female's menstruation or the period or the bleeding. So that brings you to day 1, and day 1 again starts the bleeding phase. And then we go back through and cycle and then start to build up again. All right, so I know that's a lot of information, but you can rewatch this and look at the graph again to kind of see how everything coordinates. So importantly, you see the ovarian cycle on the top coordinating very nicely with the menstrual cycle on the bottom. All right, so one of the things that we can take away from this for application, and this will be important to know, you'll need to know this for the exam, is thinking about contraception and basically when a female wants to get pregnant or does not want to get pregnant. It all comes down to ovulation. Right? If the female wants to get pregnant, then you want to know when ovulation occurs, because when the egg is released from the ovaries, that's when the female can get pregnant. And as long as there's no egg being released from the ovaries, the female cannot get pregnant. So we'll talk about kind of both ways. So first, let's talk about if a woman wants to get pregnant. She can use something called an ovulation predictor test. So here we have, like, for example, predict your most fertile days. So this ovulation predictor test can help get the woman pregnant. And how it works is it's literally this stick, and you dip it into your urine, and it's going to try and detect a hormone. So based on what you know about the female cycle, how do you think this test works, or what hormone is it looking for? So you can pause the video, think about it, review. All right, basically what this test is looking for is the LH surge. Now let's review. Why the LH surge? If you go back, recall right here, ovulation, day 14, remember, right before that is the LH surge. So if you can detect this LH surge, you know that ovulation is coming, usually within 24 hours. So that's what the ovulation predictor test is looking for. And remember, LH is just a hormone. It's cycling through your blood, and it eventually gets secreted into your urine, which is why urine tests can predict it. All right. So again, please keep that in mind for the final exam. if you want to know when you ovulate, a good way to know is to detect that LH surge, which you know happens right before ovulation, and is what actually causes the ovulation. All right, here's a second question for you. If a female has no or low estrogen, then she will not have an LH surge and will not ovulate. All right, okay. So this is actually true. So remember, what causes the LH surge in the first place? It's the estrogen being released from the follicle. So remember, estrogen has a couple of roles. One is to help build up the endometrium, but the second one is to cause that LH surge and therefore cause the ovulation. So again, if you go back and review, right, remember we said the buildup of the estrogen right here is what causes that LH surge. So again, estrogen builds up the endometrium and causes the LH surge, which then causes ovulation. So the reason why I bring this up is because if you can manage to keep the female on no or low estrogen, she doesn't have an LH surge and she will not ovulate. Think, can she get pregnant? No. Right? Without ovulation, with no egg being released from the ovaries, she cannot get pregnant. So that's actually how birth control pills work. So here you can kind of see a cycle of birth control, and what it does is it keeps you in a low or no estrogen state, so you don't get the surge, you don't ovulate, and if you don't ovulate, you can't get pregnant. So what it essentially does is this is a contraceptive method. Contraceptive meaning, again, trying to control pregnancy. So birth control pills have about a 98% chance of working accurately. It's a synthetic level of progesterone and estrogen, and it usually runs for about a 3-week cycle. So what it does is it keeps you in this luteal phase. So it keeps you on this side where you get low or no estrogen, and it also moderates your level of progesterone. It tricks your body into thinking you're in the second half of your cycle, in other words, after ovulation. And so therefore it prevents you from ovulating. Here's another contraceptive method, and this one I don't recommend. It's only 75% effective. It's called the rhythm method. So again, the whole idea is you can only get pregnant if you ovulate. So what the rhythm method does is it tries to predict, based on the timing and the length of the female's menstrual cycle, when ovulation is going to occur, and the idea is that you don't have intercourse around that time of ovulation. So a couple of things we need to know for the rhythm method is, one is right after that oocyte is released or ovulated, that oocyte is only good for up to about 24 hours. After 24 hours, the oocyte has actually already traveled down the fallopian tube to the uterus and is on the way out of the female's body. So if a woman wants to get pregnant, about 1 day, that window of 1 day after ovulation is going to be key, because that's when the egg is around to be fertilized by the sperm. So you might be thinking, gosh, well, is there only a 1-day window for a female to get pregnant out of her entire cycle? Like, that seems really small. And you start to wonder, like, how do people ever get pregnant? Well, it turns out, think about the sperm. Sperm, how long does it last for? Typical sperm pretty easily lasts up to about 48 hours. So if you have ovulation here, again, you've got this 1-day window before the ova become inviable. But if the sperm can last in the female's tract for 48 hours, then think about before, right? The sperm can enter about 2 days before and just chill and hang out in the female's reproductive tract, waiting for ovulation to occur. And once the egg is released, then the sperm is there ready to go. So in theory, you could have intercourse 2 days before ovulation and then still get pregnant. So this 3-day window is really the ideal time for pregnancy, or if you don't want to get pregnant, you avoid intercourse during that 3-day window. But here's also another thing. Research is showing that some sperm can actually last longer than 48 hours, 72 hours, and they've even found sperm that lasts up to 5 days. So think about it, that's like super sperm, right? So if you can get a sperm that can last up to 5 days, you could really have the sperm enter the female's reproductive tract back here like 5 days before ovulation and still be around to fertilize the egg. So now our window is getting bigger and bigger. But you can also see how this is a very not the best reliability and method for birth control, because one, you don't know exactly when the female is going to ovulate, right? 28 days is standard, but a female cycle can vary, right, from month to month. And even within that cycle, it's not exactly in the middle that every female ovulates. And then plus, you don't know what type of sperm enters, and you don't know exactly how long the egg is going to be good for. Again, this is why it's only 75% effective. Another interesting way to detect when ovulation occurs is actually by your body temperature, your basal body temperature. It's pretty steady, and then right at ovulation it dips, and then it peaks higher. So some women actually take their temperature every day and they look for this dip and then the spike. But notice the axis here. We're talking 0.5 degrees Celsius. So it's not that much fluctuation. So a lot of times it's really hard to detect the proper dip and then the resulting spike. So again, this method is not necessarily the easiest to track or the best. All right, so just to summarize, recall that we talked about making sperm and egg. Spermatogenesis produces sperm in the testes, whereas oogenesis produces eggs, which are surrounded by follicles in the ovary. Make sure for the final exam you review some of the key differences between spermatogenesis and oogenesis. Right? Remember, spermatogenesis is happening all the time in men. One cell produces 4 sperm, and they end up releasing over possibly over 50 million sperm in one ejaculation. Oogenesis is we start off with 1 cell and it only gets 1 egg, which is actually only completing meiosis after fertilization. We know that hormones control and coordinate the ovarian and menstrual cycles. Remember, ovarian and menstrual cycle have to be coordinated. And then finally, contraception is based on the ovulation of the oocyte. No ovulation, no pregnancy. All right, so that's basically what we're going to cover up to on the final exam, is knowing this, what we've covered so far in reproduction. This next part is not going to be directly covered on the final, but one thing I do want you to know for the final exam is just the generic overall sequencing of development. So remember, fertilization happens first if there's pregnancy. That's when the sperm meets the egg. After fertilization, you have pregnancy. And then remember, after pregnancy is parturition. Parturition is the actual birth. So for the final exam, please know this order. You don't have to know the details of all of this. Again, we didn't get time to cover that in class. But what I do need you to know is the order. So fertilization, then pregnancy, then parturition, which is the birth. All right. Okay, so we're going to stop there, and now you have all the information for the final exam. Of course, please feel free to contact me via email if you have any questions on reproduction or otherwise.